The FBI smeared Jean Seberg's pregnancy. They planted a false story in the press claiming her unborn child belonged to a Black Panther leader. The stress sent her into premature labor. Her daughter lived 2 days. That is what the documents say. What the history books say is different. They say Jean Seberg was a troubled actress who fell apart on her own. Mentally unstable, politically naive, undone by her own fragility. And that in August 1979, she died alone in the backseat of a car on a Paris street. Probable suicide. The story of a woman who couldn't hold herself together. The FBI smear. The premature birth. The infant's death. 9 years of psychiatric collapse tied to one specific date. The anniversary of that baby's birthday, August 25th. And then a body in a car with questions the French coroner never fully answered. 2 versions of the same woman. The FBI's files contain one. Every encyclopedia published before 1980 contains the other. One of these versions required a federal operation to build. The other required nothing, except a world willing to believe a woman destroyed herself. We are reading the files. They wrote her story for her. The tragic muse reads the version she actually lived. Subscribe so the real version survives. Jean Seberg arrived in Hollywood the way America loved best. From nowhere, chosen by a stranger, elevated overnight. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a pharmacist and a schoolteacher in Marshalltown, Iowa, a flat prairie town where nothing much happened except what you made happen yourself. In 1956, director Otto Preminger ran a nationwide talent search for a young woman to play Joan of Arc in his film St. Joan. More than 18,000 girls and young women auditioned. Preminger chose Seberg. Not yet 18, no screen experience, no Hollywood connections, just a face from Iowa that he believed could carry the most famous martyr in history. The discovery was news across America. The pharmacist's daughter. A small-town girl. The story wrote itself. The film did not. St. Joan was released in 1957 to bruising reviews. Critics found the performance stiff, the production cold. Seberg, who had been placed in the center of something far beyond her experience, absorbed much of the blame. Preminger cast her again in Bonjour Tristesse, and again the notices were qualified. A narrative began to harden around her, that she had been chosen too young, elevated too fast, and was not, underneath the original promise, a great actress. It followed her like weather. Then came 1960, and everything changed. Jean-Luc Godard cast her in Breathless as Patricia Franchini, an American drifting through Paris, selling the New York Herald Tribune on the street corners. Cropped hair, wide eyes, something unknowable in her stillness. The performance was unlike anything American cinema had trained its women to give. She was not performing. She was simply being, and the camera could not look away. Overnight she became an international icon, the face of French New Wave cinema, a woman whose presence on screen quietly rewrote what presence could mean. She lived between 2 worlds after that. In Paris she moved through literary circles, married the celebrated French novelist and diplomat Romain Gary, had a son, Alexander Diego Gary, in 1962. In Hollywood she made Lilith opposite Warren Beatty, the role that finally silenced the critics who had dismissed her after St. Joan. Then Paint Your Wagon, An Airport, and a string of films that kept her working on both continents through the 1960s. Off-screen, she gave money to causes she believed in. The NAACP, a Native American school near Marshalltown. The Black Panther Party, to which she donated an estimated $10,500, and for whom she used the code name Aretha in certain circles. Knowing that being seen too clearly could cost her, she was careful, and she was not careful enough. By the late 1960s, the FBI had opened a file on her. She was photographed with activists. Her phones were tapped. She had met Hakeem Jamal, a fervent Malcolm X supporter and cousin by marriage to Malcolm's widow, and had been romantically involved with him. In 1969, while filming Macho Callahan in Durango, Mexico, she began a relationship with a young student revolutionary named Carlos Ornelas Navarra. By early 1970, she was pregnant with his child. Her ex-husband Romain Gary publicly claimed the pregnancy as his own, trying to shield her from what he already sensed was coming. He was right to sense it. He just couldn't stop it. The version of Jean Seberg that most people inherited says the following. She was a woman of genuine talent who made poor choices, surrounded herself with dangerous people, and gradually fell apart. The hospitalizations, the suicide attempts, the erratic behavior on film sets, the marriages that collapsed, the deepening mental illness, the final disappearance on a Paris night in August 1979. Her body found wrapped in a blanket in the back seat of her own car, dead for days before anyone found her, a note in her hand. The version says she was tragic in the way that is easiest to accept. A woman who was always going to break, who was finally broken. That version survived for decades. It was in the reference books. It was the shape of every obituary. It was the story her name carried every time someone typed it into a search engine. There was just one problem. The unraveling was not hers. It was ordered, authorized, and executed on paper before she had any idea it was coming. J. Edgar Hoover had been director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 46 years by 1970. He had run the bureau since 1924. He had outlasted Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson. He had files on senators, on cabinet members, on the sitting president. He knew what the files were for. The program he used to target Jean Seberg was called COINTELPRO, the Count. Our intelligence program, officially active from 1956 to 1971. Its stated purpose was national security. Its operational purpose, as the documents eventually revealed, was the surveillance, infiltration, and deliberate destruction of political movements and individuals Hoover considered subversive. Martin Luther King Jr. was on the list. The NAACP was on the list. By the late 1960s, the Black Panther Party was a priority target, and anyone who supported them financially was, in the Bureau's language, a candidate for neutralization. Jean Seberg had given $10,500 to the Panthers. That put her on the list. Paul Newman had given money too. So had Elizabeth Taylor. Otto Preminger himself was sympathetic to the movement. None of them were neutralized. Seberg was younger, less established in Hollywood, already marked in the cultural press as an unstable figure, and, crucially, pregnant. That made her something the others were not. Vulnerable and usable. On April 27, 1970, Richard W. Held, the special agent in charge of COINTELPRO operations in the FBI's Los Angeles field office, drafted a formal cable to Hoover's office in Washington. The cable requested authorization for a specific operation. Contact Hollywood gossip columnists and plant a story claiming that Jean Seberg's pregnancy was not the result of her relationship with Romaine Gary, as was publicly understood, but the result of an affair with a member of the Black Panther Party. The cable was not vague about its purpose. It stated plainly that the publication of this story could cause her embarrassment and serve to cheapen her image with the general public. That is the language of a federal memo. That is a government document. Those are the words a special agent in charge wrote to his director about a pregnant actress. And the director did not refuse. J. Edgar Hoover approved the operation. He added one procedural note. Wait approximately 2 additional months before deploying the St. Ori until Seberg's pregnancy was, in his words, obvious to everyone. Make the image impossible to ignore. Let the body do the work. Then he wrote his closing line. 6 words. Jean Seberg has been a financial supporter of the BPP and should be neutralized. Read that slowly. A woman who gave money to a civil rights organization, $10,000, her own money freely given, and the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation authorized a psychological warfare operation against her unborn child. The mechanism chosen was elegant in its cruelty. It required no violence, no arrest, no charges, no due process. It required only the weaponization of 2 things that already existed in America in 1970. A gossip press that asked no questions about its sources, and a culture primed with deep anxiety about interracial relationships. The lie didn't need to be airtight. It only needed to be printed. The printing was arranged. On May 19, 1970, Los Angeles Times gossip columnist Joyce Haber ran a blind item. She described an unnamed international movie actress who supported the Black Revolution and was reportedly pregnant by a prominent black militant. She did not use Seberg's name. She didn't need to. Anyone in Hollywood knew who was described. The item had been passed to Haber through the Times editorial chain, from an FBI-connected tip, through a reporter, through the Metro editor, and onto the page, with no apparent verification requested at any step. Weeks later, Newsweek ran the story with Seberg's name directly attached. The story spread. He didn't lie loudly. He built a delivery system and let the normal operations of American media do the rest. That is the architecture of the false version. That is who built it and how. Not a conspiracy that required secrecy between many people. A memo, an approval, a phone call to a gossip columnist, and a culture that was ready to believe exactly what it was told. Jean Seberg was 7 months pregnant when Newsweek PR. In her name. She read the story. She knew exactly what it was, not because she was paranoid, but because the FBI had tapped her phones and she had been watching the surveillance of civil rights supporters for 2 years. She knew the operation was real before most people in her life understood one was being run. And she went into premature labor. On August 23, 1970, she gave birth to a daughter. The baby weighed 4 pounds. Her name was Nina Hart Gary. She was Romaine Gary's name on the birth record. Gary had publicly claimed the pregnancy as his, trying to protect Seberg from exactly what was already happening. The real father was Carlos Navarra. Nina Hart Gary lived for 2 days. She died on August 25, 1970. And then something happened at the funeral that the comfortable version of this story has never been able to absorb. The baby was brought back to Marshalltown to be buried. And before the burial, before this 4-pound infant girl was laid in the ground, the coffin was opened. It was opened to prove, to the satisfaction of whoever required proof, that the child was white. That the story Newsweek had printed was false. That the baby's race could be established visually as evidence against the lie. Hold that for a moment. A grieving mother's infant daughter. Coffin. Opened. So that people could look at a dead baby's skin and establish that she was not the child the FBI had said she was. That is what the smear campaign made necessary. That is the wound the lie created in its first month of life. Not abstractly, not statistically, but physically, in a cemetery in Iowa, in August 1970. The lie had reached into the casket. The first crack in the comfortable story is this. Romaine Gary, who knew Seberg for 20 years, who was the father of her son Diego and who remained in her life until the end, was specific about what happened next. Every year after August 1970, he said, Jean Seberg attempted to end her life on August 25th, the anniversary of the baby's death, not randomly, not triggered by vague depression. On that specific date, year after year, that is not a woman undone by internal fragility. That is a woman with a specific wound on a specific date caused by a specific event that the world had been told did not exist. The second crack. When Seberg and Gary sued Newsweek for libel, they won. In 1974, the court awarded them $20,000 in damages, a formal legal acknowledgement that what Newsweek had printed was false. The story was false. The settlement was real. It was on the record. But the correction did not travel as far as the original story. The settlement was a legal event. The original smear had been a cultural one. And culture does not correct itself on a court schedule. The $20,000 did not bring Nina Hart Gary back. It did not undo the 9 years of August 25 THS that were still ahead of Seberg when the settlement was reached. It did not change what most people already believed about her. The third crack was in the files the Bureau eventually released. Years after Seberg's death, the April 27, 1970 cable was made public. The authorization memo, Hoover's signature, the language about cheapening her image, the word neutralized. Everything Held had proposed and Hoover had approved, in their own words, now accessible to anyone who asked. The official story had been built on a classified foundation. When the classification ended, the foundation was visible. The lie was always in the paperwork. It just took years for the paperwork to surface. The real version does not emerge through a single revelation. It emerges through what the lie had to actively maintain to survive, and what each maintenance cost. What had to be erased first? The cause. The comfortable story required one essential piece of work. The FBI had to remain absent from the narrative of Seberg's breakdown. Not hidden exactly, the Bureau's general interest in radical sympathizers was publicly known. But the specific April 27th cable, the specific authorization, the specific decision to weaponize her pregnancy, those had to stay classified long enough for the story of her decline to settle into historical fact before anyone could connect the decline to its documented origin. And they did stay classified long enough. By the time the documents were publicly available, the troubled actress narrative had been in print for years. The correction came late, came quietly, and landed in a media ecosystem that had already moved on. What this required was not ongoing conspiracy. It required only that a bureau maintain its own classification schedules and that a press culture never ask, with sufficient persistence, why a woman who had been the subject of a federal smear operation might be struggling in exactly the ways she was struggling. No one in the mainstream press made that connection while she was alive. Not loudly. Not in ways that reached the same audiences who had read Newsweek in 1970. What had to be erased second? The causal chain. Nina Hart-Gary's death could not, inside the comfortable version, be connected to the smear campaign. If it was connected, if stress induced by a federal psychological warfare operation caused the premature labor that caused the infant's death, then the question became unbearable. Did the FBI kill a child? That chain is not speculation. Romaine Gary stated it explicitly. A pregnant woman read a lie about herself in a national magazine. She went into premature labor. Her daughter was born 2 months early, at 4 pounds, and died 2 days later. The father of that woman's son, a man who was present, who knew the timeline, who later stood before journalists and said it out loud, made the connection direct and public. Hiding this required the severance of that sequence in every public account. The birth had to be treated as medically incidental. The stress had to be treated as background. And so it was in every obituary, in every profile, in every encyclopedia summary, because tracing the sequence required engaging with a federal document that wasn't publicly available until after the funerals. What had to be erased third? The pattern of August 25 THS. This is the detail that almost broke the comfortable version while Seberg was still alive. 9 consecutive years. Each August 25th, the anniversary of the baby's death, she attempted to die. According to Gary, who witnessed this pattern across the years they remained close after their divorce. 9 times. On one specific date. If that pattern had been widely published and connected to the documented cause of the baby's death, the sequence would have been impossible to read as simple mental illness. A woman attempting to die annually on the date her infant daughter died, a daughter whose death was connected, explicitly by the child's own father on the public record, to a federal smear operation. That is not depression in the abstract. That is grief with a cause. Grief with a name attached to it. Grief with a classified cable at its origin. The pattern stayed private because Gary protected it. For reasons of dignity, for reasons of love, for whatever calculation a person makes when they are trying to hold together what is left of someone who is still alive. He did not tell the press while she could still be saved. He told them after her body was found. By then, the window for intervention had closed. What was almost missed entirely, her own attempts to fight back. The comfortable version requires Seberg to be passive. A victim of her own fragility. Someone to whom things happened, not someone who fought back. That version erases something the record contains. She fought back with every tool available to her. She and Gary sued Newsweek and won. Her lawyers filed for access to her FBI file while she was alive and obtained portions of the April 27th cable. She knew what the documents said. She was not confused about what had been done to her. She was someone who had seen the mechanism, understood it, and was trying to expose it through legal means in the years before her death. The false version required her to be a woman in decline. What the record shows is a woman who was simultaneously in crisis and fighting the institution responsible for it, and who was doing so with lawyers and court filings while the world watched her fall apart and attributed the falling entirely to her own nature. That is the most complete erasure of all. Not of a fact, but of her agency. The story that survived stripped her of the one thing she never surrendered. Her understanding of what had been done to her, and her refusal to let it go unchallenged. The false version required constant maintenance. That is the part they never expected anyone to notice. She kept Romain Gary. Not as a husband, they divorced in 1970, the same year the baby died. But after the divorce he remained in her life in a form the comfortable story has rarely examined. They lived in the same apartment building in Paris. They spoke. He knew her. He knew the chronology, the dates, the specific shape of what the Bureau had done to her pregnancy. He carried the knowledge of what had happened across the years when she could not speak it publicly, and when she was no longer able to speak it at all. She did not sever that connection. There is no document that says she made a deliberate calculation to keep Gary close as a witness to the truth. But there is this: he was there when it happened, he remained present through the years of August 25 THS, and when she was gone, he was the one who stood before journalists and named it. The truth she had been trying to surface through lawyers and lawsuits, the truth the Bureau had classified into near invisibility, survived in the man she had stayed close to. She pursued the file. While she was alive, while she was being hospitalized and medicated and described in the press as an unstable woman in decline, her lawyers were filing freedom of information requests for her own federal records. They obtained portions of the April 27 cable. They knew what was in it. In the mid-1970s, years before her death, those documents were in the hands of people who were fighting on her behalf. She wanted the paperwork visible. She understood that the Bureau's own language was the one thing the comfortable story could not survive. Cheapen her image. Should be neutralized. Those words, written by federal agents and signed by the director of the FBI, meant something different from any accusation she could make in her own voice. They were the lie's own confession, sitting inside a classification system. She pushed to surface them. The documents that broke the comfortable version open, in the end, were the same ones her lawyers had been working toward while she was still alive. The lawsuit came closest while she was breathing. The Newsweek settlement in 1974 is often described as a footnote. It was not a footnote. It was a federal court confirming, in binding legal language, that a major American magazine had published a false story about a pregnant woman's unborn child, $20,000 in damages, an acknowledgement on the record that the story was fabricated. What the settlement could not do was force the correction to travel at the speed of the original lie. The Newsweek story had run nationally with Seberg's name in the summer of 1970 when she was visibly pregnant. The correction was a civil filing in 1974. The audiences were not the same. The cultural impression left by the original story, that something scandalous and questionable had attended her pregnancy, did not dissolve because of a ruling that most people who had read the original story never knew existed. The lawsuit won the legal argument and lost the cultural one. She knew that. She kept fighting anyway. The act that left the most was the one she could not control. The night of August 30th, 1979. Ahmed Hasni, the Algerian actor she had been with in the final months of her life, later told reporters what happened that night. They had gone to the movies. They came home. She seemed fine. In the morning, she was gone. She had taken her papers, her blanket, her barbiturates, and a bottle of water. The note she left was addressed to her son, Diego Gary, Alexander Diego Gary, the boy she had with Romain Gary, the child she had raised, was the one she wrote to. Not to the world. Not to the press. Not to the Bureau. To her son in French. Forgive me. I can no longer live with my nerves. That note is in the record. Diego received it. He was the last person she thought of before she left. The machinery that kept the wrong story alive did not require ongoing conspiracy. It required only the normal operation of institutions that had every incentive to let the lie stand. It ran on the gossip press. Joyce Haber of the Los Angeles Times ran the blind item in May 1970 because a source she had reason to trust passed it to her through the editorial chain. She did not know she was carrying FBI material. She may have believed she was reporting something true. She published it. It ran. The mechanism required only that one person with a column do what gossip columnists do. Print what they're told by sources they trust. And the operation succeeded before anyone in the Bureau had to do anything further. Joyce Haber was later fired from the Los Angeles Times, though not specifically for the Seberg item. The man who first received the FBI tip at the paper passed it up the chain, and enabled its publication faced no public accounting at all. It ran on Newsweek's willingness to name her. Where Haber had at least used a blind item, Newsweek published Seberg's name directly. The story moved from gossip column implication to national magazine fact in a matter of weeks. The two outlets together accomplished what neither could have done alone. The blind item reached Hollywood insiders, and the Newsweek story reached everyone else. When the settlement came in 1974 and Newsweek acknowledged the story was false, the acknowledgement appeared without the prominence of the original publication. No front-page correction. No headline matching the scale of what they had printed. A legal settlement is not a cultural retraction, and the culture had already moved on. It ran on the narrative convenience of a woman already in distress. Here is the mechanism's most disturbing property. Because the smear campaign worked, because Seberg did deteriorate, did require hospitalization, did make suicide attempts, did struggle visibly through the 1970s, the comfortable story was able to point to the consequences of the operation as proof that no operation was required. She was falling apart. That was evidence of her own fragility. The fact that the falling apart had begun in August 1970, in the months immediately following the baby's death, following the smear, following the coffin being opened, that sequence was not examined. Not publicly. Not loudly enough to change the story. The machinery created the damage. Then it pointed to the damage. It ran on the absence of Hoover. By the time the April 27th cable was declassified and the Bureau's own language was visible to journalists and historians, J. Edgar Hoover had been dead for years. He died in May 1972. There was no one to face a microphone and answer for what the memo said. The Bureau issued its acknowledgement of the operation, including the now famous line, release days after Seberg's death. The days when the FBI used derogatory information to combat advocates of unpopular causes have long since passed. We are out of that business forever. They said this about an operation their director had authorized in writing with a signature and then died before he could be held to account for it. The Bureau confessed in the past tense to a director who was no longer alive to be named. Return to both versions now. The first one, the troubled actor, SS who fell apart, contains inside it every specific cost that kept it standing. A columnist who printed without verifying, a magazine that named her without independent confirmation, a culture eager to believe the worst about a woman who had done something it found threatening. The second version, the woman whose government destroyed her, contains inside it every act of preservation that kept the truth from disappearing entirely. The lawsuit won, the file pursued, the witness kept close, the press conference Romaine Gary gave the morning after her body was found. Both versions have been in the historical record for decades now. The question is only which one you were given first. Each version left physical residue in the world. Not metaphor, not interpretation. Objects, documents, locations, still there, still accessible, still containing exactly what they contained on the day they were made. The false version left a blind item in the Los Angeles Times archive. Published May 19, 1970, by Joyce Haber, describing an unnamed international actress pregnant with the child of a black militant. It was not removed when the truth became clear. It was not flagged as FBI-sourced disinformation. It sits in the archive as it was printed, and anyone who looks at it will find it exactly as the Bureau intended. A gossip item, apparently ordinary, with no visible fingerprints. It left the Newsweek story with Seberg's name. That story exists alongside the 1974 settlement that declared it false. Both documents are accessible. The lie and its legal correction exist in the same historical record, one slightly louder than the other, waiting for whoever looks for them. It left encyclopedia entries and reference book summaries that were written in the years before the FBI files were public and never updated. Physical books, still on library shelves in some places, that carry the unstable actress version as settled fact. The false version is still the default context in sources that W.R. compiled before anyone read the cable, and it left the FBI's own acknowledgement, issued in the days after Seberg's body was found, as Romaine Gary's press conference was still echoing in the French and American press. The Bureau stated that it had planted the pregnancy story. It acknowledged the operation. It published the now staggering claim that it was out of that business forever. The false version's confession, issued by the institution that had built the false version, is in the same archive as everything else. The institution did not disappear after admitting what it had done. It issued a press release and continued. The real version left the April 27, 1970 cable. Declassified, accessible through Freedom of Information requests, containing Held's proposal and Hoover's authorization in their exact original language. Cheapen her image with the general public. Should be neutralized. The document exists. It is not reconstructed, not summarized, not interpreted by anyone with an argument to make. It is the original. The handwriting is on the page. It left the grave of Nina Hart Gary in Riverside Cemetery in Marshalltown, Iowa. Born August 23, 1970. Dead August 25, 1970. 2 days old. Buried in the town where her mother was raised, in the state where Jean Seberg's family still lived, after a burial at which the coffin was opened to establish what the lie had put in question. That grave is still in Marshalltown. It is a physical fact. Anyone can visit it. It left Romain Gary's press conference on the record. The statement he gave after Seberg's body was identified, naming the FBI's campaign as the origin of her death. His words are sourced. They were reported. The journalists who covered it are on record. His statement is not a rumor or a family claim. It is a press conference given publicly by a man who was a Nobel Prize-winning author and a decorated French diplomat, who had been inside this story since 1970 and who chose, in the days after Jean Seberg's death, to put everything he knew before anyone who would print it. 14 months after that press conference, on December 2, 1980, Romain Gary shot himself at his apartment in Paris. He left a note. It said his death was unconnected to Seberg's. Whether that is entirely true, no document can say. And it left the question about the car that the French coroner never answered with certainty. Jean Seberg disappeared on the night of August 30, 1979. Her body was found on September 8, 9 days later, in the back seat of her white Renault, parked in the 16th arrondissement near her apartment, wrapped in her blanket. The police toxicology report found 7.94 grams of alcohol per liter in her system. To understand what that number means, a blood alcohol level above 3 grams per liter will typically induce a coma in most adults. At 7.94 grams per liter, the probability that she could have driven the car or done much of anything requiring physical coordination before losing consciousness is physiologically close to zero. The car was covered in leaves when it was found, suggesting it had been parked for some time. But police noted that the neighborhood was well-trafficked and that a vehicle parked in that precise location for the full 9 days would likely have been noticed before it was. The timeline of when the car arrived at its final position was never definitively established. Her corrective lenses, which she maintained she could not drive without, were not with her when the body was found. The note was in her hand, addressed to Diego. The French coroner's official ruling was probable suicide. Probable. Not certain, not confirmed. The word the coroner chose was probable, which is the word you use when the evidence points in one direction but something in the evidence will not quite close. That word is in the record, alongside the cable, alongside the memo, alongside the grave in Marshalltown and the confession the Bureau issued and the press conference Romain Gary gave and the coffin that was opened so the world could see a dead baby's skin. The false version left an image of a woman who could not hold herself together. The real version left the documents that show exactly who took her apart, and the question, still unanswered, of what happened on a Paris street in August 1979, when a woman whose government had spent a decade destroying her ended up dead in a car that the forensic evidence suggests she could not have driven herself. Both versions are in the record now. The record is open.